Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. So, in this video, I wanted to discuss an idea I had about. This continues a series on, I guess you'd call it, re-engineering the government, or figuring out how to optimize the design of the system we have in the United States specifically. Although this, solution or proposition could apply to any system. So it not only touches upon American politics, but comparative politics as well. So, the idea is that having a national executive may actually be a redundancy, not only a redundancy and an inefficient office, right, political office to even have, but also a potentially dangerous office to establish if it's not properly constrained and limited, right? As we have it now, we have a chief executive in which we call a president, and the office of the president and the commander in chief are not separate. The president is the commander in chief and is the governor of the military. He or she also, traditionally, he also has the power to, he has a legislative role as well. So his role is not solely executive, it is also legislative. He or she has some say in whether a piece of legislation becomes law, right? He or she is a part of that process of determining whether a piece of legislation becomes law in the form of a veto power. So the president has the ability to veto a bill that he or she deems not a good thing. So, but and I think that there probably does need to be some sort of veto power, that exists. I think that there certainly does need to be a commander-in-chief, but whether the necessity of either of these two functions requires there being a national executive is the question, right? And I don't necessarily think that having a national executive office is required to have a government that can effectively carry out the executive veto function and the commander-in-chief function. Obviously, we sort of generally regard the we regard the executive branch as implementing and enforcing law. We regard the judicial branch as interpreting law and ascertaining its legal validity, and we regard the legislative branch as creating legislation and creating law, if you will. But this role of implementation, this implementation function that the executive office is supposed to serve, actually doesn't require there to be a separate national executive office, right? There are other offices that can be used similarly, right, and probably with more efficacy to implement and enforce the law that Congress creates and that the Supreme Court interprets. So in some sense, from the perspective of efficiency, which is a very important consideration when trying to evaluate whether different government offices and institutions are valid, it may be the case that a national executive office is simply a redundancy, a logistical redundancy, an institutional, constitutional redundancy that we could do away with. We have to we have to look at the economics of power and the effects of enlarging the power, putting power into political offices and enlarging the powers of political offices, and we can't actually make. Obviously, we would regard constraints on power, right, to be a necessary and good thing, and otherwise it's not regulated. It isn't directed right toward the proper types of activities and the proper types of aims, and can be used for purposes we would regard as bad purposes. So I think fundamentally, do we need a separate national executive office, right, to implement the law, to enforce the law, to perform this veto role, to perform the commander-in-chief role? Do we actually need this one person instated and given assigned power? Do we actually need this structure, right, in our government? Societies across time have had discretionary executives with expanded discretionary powers, right? Kings and queens and presidents and monarchs and chancellors and what do they call it in the UK? Oh, prime ministers, stuff like this. You have this primary role. You have this power being assigned to some sort of person that's supposed to perform some sort of executive role, and they're the face of a nation, right? Societies have done that across time, and it seems necessary because it's been historically ever present. But just because it's historically ever present does not necessarily mean that it's absolutely necessary from an economics and ethics and political science perspective. There could be other ways. There could be other systems, and we could imagine other offices, performing the same roles, providing the same benefits without the costs. So, what would be the alternative if we were to, do away with a national executive office? What would who would perform the commander-in-chief role? Who would perform the veto role? And who would perform the primary enforcing, bureaucratic enforcement role of legislation created by Congress, and passed by Congress, and judged valid by the Supreme Court? Well, the reason I would regard a separate national executive office as a redundancy is because each state actually has, each one of the states within the United States actually has their own governor, right? So each state has its own executive, right? We've got then 50 governors, 50 executives governing the states. Why do we need an additional executive if we already have the 50 executives? And we might even say that Puerto Rico is included in this, so we have 51 executives, whatever other non-state U.S. territories are. Okay, so in some sense, if the role of the national executive is to implement and enforce law, that could just as easily be done by the states respectively under the auspices of the 50 state governors. So, at least I think it could. If the primary role of the executive, the national executive, is implementation and enforcement, This could just as easily be done by the 51 state executives, state governors, just as effectively, if not more effectively, because they understand more intimately the issues and the problems within their respective states within the United States. So, all right. But then some somewhat knotty issues arise. How would those 50 state governors, how would these respective separate executive offices, how would they veto bills, right? Because certainly we've acknowledged that some sort of executive veto function is necessary. Okay, that's easy, right? Basically, instead of one person and one executive deciding whether a bill should become law by their own vote, right? A single vote, their single executive, their singular executive judgment. What determines whether the executive, right, either vetoes or signs a bill into law will actually not be the judgment of one, but the vote of many, right? So you'd actually have the 50 state governors or the 51 state governors vote, right, on whether this bill should become law. And then you simply tabulate the majority, what gets the majority. If the majority says that the veto option is correct, then the bill is vetoed by the executive or the executives. If the majority decides that the bill should become law, then the bill becomes law, and each sign, right? And that's that's the essential idea. To me, it's more democratic because it's much better to have, rather than having one person decide a legislative outcome, you should have more than one, right? You should have as many as possible offering their judgment to determine whether any given piece of legislation should become law. So I would trust the judgment of I would trust the judgment of more than one over the judgment of one from a democracy perspective, and in order to ensure, right, that the veto act, the veto option, is the right option, I would much rather have 2 heads, or 3 heads, or 4 heads, or 5 heads, than one, right? Therefore, it's more deliberative, and what decides whether a piece of legislation should be vetoed is the judgment of the voters, the governors, who are more intimately connected to the issues and the climate, the political climate in their states. And so what decides whether a bill is vetoed or accepted is actually decided by more than one person. And so whether the decision to either accept or veto, and so the decision to either, in this system, the decision to either accept or veto is backed by more representatives, and that makes it more inherently democratic, rather than the judgment of one, right? If we go by the logic that one cannot represent 300 million, and which is why democracy is almost an unachievable ideal. Representative democracy is not quite democracy. But if we could get more than one, let's say, whatever the majority would be, 26 to 50, I think that's much better. That's more democratic because there's more representatives are deciding the vote. So that's how we resolve that's how we reconcile doing away with the national executive with preserving the veto function of the executive in the legislative process. What about the commander-in-chief role? we think that we need this singular national executive to perform the commander-in-chief role. Who then, if we do away with the national executive, who then performs the commander-in-chief role? Who governs the military, right? Who makes these executive discretionary decisions in moments where a quick decision is necessary? A quick and informed decision is necessary. Who does that if we do away with... And this is a harder issue to resolve. But I think that what we could have is some system by which the commander-in-chief... Military decisions are in the same way decided by the majority of the 51 state governors or 50 state governors, depending on how you define, non-state U.S. territories. I think it's actually, much better for military decisions not to be, decided by a singular actor, but to be more deliberative, even in times of distress. It does not require that we vest, the power of military governance and military action in one person. I think that it could just as easily be carried out by the 50 state governors as well, acting together in concert. And it actually makes any decision made on war or peace or military occupation, it actually would make these decisions, these extremely important decisions and risky decisions, it would make the decisions. It would not vest power in one to decide, but power in a larger group to decide. And since two heads are better than one, vesting that power in a larger group by majority vote is actually better than vesting it in one, even from the perspective of some situations require us to take immediate action, and that can't be done by a group. It has to be done by one. I don't think so. Even still, what we could have is some system by which the commander-in-chief, the one who makes the final decision in certain moments of distress that require immediate action, that could actually be performed. We could have the governors themselves could, we could have some system by which the commander-in-chief role is performed by, some process by which one of the state governors is elected from the 50 state governors to perform this role, right? Or at least to decide the vote and to cause the group to act in coordination, right? I think that may be a better system, because I was just thinking about, why does the commander-in-chief role have to be synonymous with the president role? Why can't we separate these offices? Why are they in the same office? There's good logic for their being in the same office and for there being a national executive to perform the commander-in-chief role. But it's not absolutely necessary. Military action and decision-making can be undertaken among the 50 state governors and executives. Maybe one of them is elected to serve as the commander-in-chief, or maybe we still elect a president to serve as the commander-in-chief, but the veto function is performed by the 50 state governors, and the implementation function through bureaucracy is performed by the 50 state governors, and we simply limit the office of the president more and more to just serving this commander-in-chief role, sort of the head of the nation, figurehead role that has the military decision-making power. I think that could work too, but ultimately I don't think that we need a national executive to perform this commander-in-chief role. I think, military action and decision-making can be simply undertaken by the 50 state governors acting in concert with each other in a coordinated moment of distress that then causes them to use power to achieve a necessary outcome in a military game or conflict. So it's just an idea. It's sort of a way to re-engineer and look at each of the offices and branches from the perspective of efficiency and ask whether they are strictly necessary from an economics, ethics, and political science perspective. So I just don't think that they happen to be. That all branches are inherently valid or necessary at all times, simply because the founders thought so. The founders did design a very brilliant system, and the logic they used to justify institutions was extremely brilliant. But humans are flawed, and so we have to rethink our thinking on things continually, over and over again. This is not reinventing the wheel, it's just improving the wheel. So anyway, that's the basic idea. I don't think that I really have anything more to say about it. Hopefully it's an interesting idea, and I would love to get comments back on it, because this one is a little bit more pie in the sky. But hopefully it takes the pie or the cake. So in any case, thank you for watching, and like and subscribe.